All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Week 14 edition of the Football Diehards DFS show. We are back after a couple of weeks hiatus due to the holidays and sickness and other things that pop up this time of year. But we're happy to be with you here on a special time this week. 5 o'clock Eastern, we're going to run through the entire Week 14 DFS slate. And we're here for your questions. We're here for whatever you want to know. If it's playoff time for you, if this is the last week to get in the playoffs, we'll do whatever we can. My name is Jamie Calandro at JAC3600, joined as always by my amazing co-host, Fantasy NAV Eric Romoff. Eric, before we get into it, so we don't talk about this. We haven't talked about this much on the shows in recent, but you spearhead that pros with Joe's. An amazing charity league that I'm happy to have been a part of for the last 3 years. My partner and I are getting smoked again due to injuries and everything. So we aren't making the playoffs, but how is it looking as we're going into the playoffs there for that? How's it been?
It's been good. We actually, we just kicked off the first round of the playoffs this week. One of the pieces of feedback that we got was that more people wanted to participate in the playoffs, so we expanded the field. So week 14, basically half of the league gets in by a variety of different measures. Because there's bye weeks, everyone starts with their average score, and then they accumulate points on top of it. And then the top 8 point scorers then advance into our championship bracket, which runs weeks 15 through 17. So just kicking it off. Everyone's super excited to find out their card was punched, or in some cases that a little disappointed that they'll have to wait till next year, but always a fun part of the year for sure.
Yeah, the top 50%. We did not crack that for sure. We had no quarterback by the end of the season. We had Deshaun Watson and Kirk Cousins as our quarterbacks that we drafted there. So once the two of them were down, it was okay losing Watson because Cousins was so good. But once he went down, that was kind of the final straw for us. We started Dorian Thompson-Robinson one week and Mac Jones another week, and that was a benching of him. And we had nothing this past week. We had no quarterback rostered. So yeah, that's the kind of year it's been for us this year. But I'm really glad that went well. I hope to be in it again with you, and you do a great job with that. All right, so we are going to get right into it. Bob is here with us. Thanks for joining us, Bob. I'm going to be on with Bob and Mike again tomorrow at 10:20 p.m. Eastern on the Football Die Hard show with Bob and Mike. They're always put on a great show, and you got to listen to them this time of year. It's playoff time for a lot of us, and they'll give you the best advice you can get. But our job is DFS, and we are going to get into it now. We got a weird one. There's the last week of buys. We got a twin bill on Monday night, one of which features my Giants going up against the Packers, who all of a sudden look like the unbeatable Packers. But, I'm glad we don't have to talk about that today. We got your Texans in after a, gutty win, even though they lost Tank Dell last week, going up against the Jets, who seems like it would be an easy win, but they still got a strong defense. So we'll get into all of that. But let's do what we do. We'll start up at the top with the quarterback position. And, kind of talk through how we feel about this in cash and GPP and stacks and everything. We're going to try and keep it under an hour for you today, so we don't ramble too much about certain players, but we're going to give you the best we possibly can to win in week 14. So quarterback, Eric, the high tier, we've got Allen and Mahomes on this slate. They're playing each other. Lamar Jackson, 2. CJ Stroud on your Texans, Justin Herbert, all of those guys are 7,500 and over. I, for one, am not touching this tier in cash. There are some skill players at running back and wide receiver that I'm heavily prioritizing for cash play this week, and that's going to probably mean a cheaper quarterback. So I'm not in on these guys. Who are you kind of leaning towards as, who you'd want to play out of this group?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird spot because we're anticipating a lot of the ownership to draw to the Chiefs and Bills game. It is not only a captivating game in and of itself, it's also far and away the highest total on the board. But because of that, at least this is how I'm making sense of it. It feels like Allen and Mahomes are kind of splitting the rostership pretty evenly to where neither of them is particularly popular where we sit here on Friday afternoon, right? So if this trend holds, if these guys are both going to be like sub 7%, I'm probably going to be way overexposed to them relative to the field. I'm imagining we'll see one of them really start to walk up. So we'll have to see where the ownership leads us, but where we sit right now, I mean, I think Josh Allen's probably the strongest play on the board. I mean, the Bills haven't exactly been finding the results they've been looking for of late, but that hasn't been because of any shortcomings of Josh Allen, right? He's just been absolutely lighting the world on fire recently. You get the rushing upside, so does plenty in terms of using his legs around the goal line well. I'd say if he's anywhere sub 10%, he's probably going to be my favorite priority. Secondary consideration, really just trying to get weird. I actually don't mind CJ Stroud this week against the Jets, largely because he's going to be one of those 1% guys, and I think he can still put up a pretty solid game overall. The weather is going to be the consideration.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. And I'm just looking at his rostership right now, and he has nothing right now. So
Right.
I think if you can get around that, that's a nice one. I'm also looking at right now Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen's compared. Mahomes is looking at about 7%, and Josh Allen's looking at about 2%. So I think we follow your logic. I think you got the right idea there. That they're going to flock to Mahomes seemingly with the better matchup on paper too, given how the Chiefs have limited quarterback play. But you're right. I mean, Josh Allen is still Josh Allen. The Bills offense is not struggling because he all of a sudden isn't doing what he does.
Yeah.
I believe I don't have the season long rankings in front of me right now, but he's at least the QB2 on the season again, right? He might even be the quarterback 1. I'll look it up while you're talking.
On average, he's QB1. Yeah.
QB1. Yeah.
So on average.
Yeah, so you're right there. I mean, there's no disparaging what that guy does on the field. So moving into the mid-tier range, still to me, there's not really a lot to love here. I think there are some cheap plays that I like a lot for cash this week. But I do like Fields a lot. He has 1 touchdown pass the last couple of weeks, and they haven't let him throw that much. And when they have been letting him throw, I don't know if you saw that last game, but it was all like line of scrimmage stuff. So that's a little bit scary for his GPP upside, I guess. But the one thing I do like about him for cash is he's run the ball 30 times the last 2 weeks. And that kind of a floor, at 6,800, if he's going to run that much, he really should be priced into the tier with the guys above. So for me at 6,800, he's a guy that I'm into for cash. If he can get up to there, I'm not going to sacrifice, spoiler alert, Christian McCaffrey or some of the top wide receivers on this slate that I think are ones you really need to pay for to get him. But I think he's a great play at quarterback. What do you think of Fields and who else in this tier for you?
Yeah, I was a little annoyed to see Justin Fields near the top in terms of projected rostership. I think a lot of that has to do with just how neatly he sets up in a cash context. So it leaves me having to do some more arithmetic on determining this 12 to 14% rostership that we're seeing now. Is that actually going to hold steady in terms of GPPs? If he's up around there, I mean, I almost have to scratch him out because he's that popular. Mm-hmm. But I think he might actually come in a little bit lower with a lot of people citing the concerns that you shared. And this is a phenomenal spot for him, right? Like I think with the bye week, we'll see the passing game and the depth of target improve a fair amount relative to the last time out that we saw. And also the Lions, they're third in the league in terms of rushing yards allowed to opposing quarterbacks. That's obviously something that Fields does quite well. So, some of this we'll suss out as we see these projections update closer and closer to Sunday. For me, anything below like a 10% rostered Fields, I'm pretty happy to click the button on. Beyond that, in the mid-tier, Brock Purdy is going to be super popular. Everyone loves building this guy up and making MVP campaigns for him. Obviously, he played very well in that last game. But for me, I mean, he's fine. He's much more of a cash play, to put it differently. I think we've seen his ceiling game, and usually that type of game isn't the primary game plan for the 49ers. So, you're really trying to catch lightning in a bottle. Russell Wilson's kind of interesting at 5.8K. This Chargers defense is largely just mailing it in, right? Like they're almost going out of their way to get Brandon Staley fired. At least so it would seem. So not a whole lot of resistance defensively for Russell Wilson. He's obviously looked a little bit better this year. And if you really want to throw a dart in GPPs, you can maybe take a look at Jameis Winston. He's going to throw the ball down the field a lot, and he has the weapons that play well in that type of environment. So 5.5K, as a GPP dart throw isn't bad on Jameis either.
Yeah, Jameis Winston. But so we should say too that Derek Carr is officially questionable.
Okay.
As is basically the entire New Orleans receiving core. Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Taysom Hill are all questionable as well. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on as we go. But yeah, I mean, Saints fans were calling for Winston to come into that game anyway, as they're getting frustrated with that. But yeah, I like that call as well. So in the lower tier, this is kind of where I'm living a little bit in the cash range. If I don't go all the way up to Fields or Purdy. And it's weird to say, but Jake Browning is standing out to me as one of the premier cash plays on this slate, which is weird because we thought that, once he came in for Burrow, that offense was going to tank. But they did not last week. He gets a pretty good matchup against Indianapolis, who are 20th in fantasy points per game allowed to quarterbacks. Browning, 8.3 yards per attempt, and he's running as well. He has arguably the best receiving core in football. So, his price didn't go up, I think is the main takeaway from this, that he's sitting there at 5,200. Playing him allows you to do pretty much whatever you want. So I'm into him for cash, and it looks like ownership is as well. So I'm comfortable with that. It doesn't feel like I'm taking a big leap doing him in cash. If his ownership was lower, I'd probably stay away and stick to GPP. And I like Minshew too on the other side of the game there. He's also running. We've seen a bad floor from him, but he's thrown the ball 83 times over the last 2 weeks, and the Bengals have allowed over 30 points in 3 of their last 4 games. So I think I'm probably going to quarterback somebody in that game for cash. Who are you into in this mid tier?
Yeah, actually, I like the Browning call overall. He really fit nicely in cash. I guess I've got a little bit of concern just based on how Cincinnati put together their game plan for him last week. They were running some looks and some plays that we hadn't seen from them all season, right? So like kudos to the head coaching staff, coaching staff in general for putting their guy in a position to win. But now the Colts have a full week to review that tape. So it will pose the question of like how many counter punches will the Cincy coaching staff have in their bag? But the way that you beat this Indianapolis secondary is at the perimeter, and he's got a couple of really good perimeter weapons. So, not a bad spot at all. I kind of like pivoting off of his ownership over to Gardner Minshew. Right now, Minshew is going to be about 1/3 the ownership, at least in terms of the projections that we're seeing today. And I mean, this Colts team, like they run up the score a lot. I think they're 8th in the NFL in scoring, at least heading into this week. While you can beat up the Colts on the perimeter, Cincinnati is much more of a pass funnel, right? They're fairly strong against the run and a little bit more susceptible against the pass. So don't mind getting to Gardner Minshew at all. Beyond that, if you want to hold your nose, Aiden O'Connell is okay. He's played better than I thought he would. I think this is a game environment that is likely to go over. I'm probably going to be building some Minnesota stacks and some Las Vegas run backs. So, I mean, he's in the pool, right? This could be a better game for him, but it's really hard to find the upside that you're looking for in this low tier outside of really Minshew and Browning, in my opinion.
No, I like the O'Connell too. I like the O'Connell call too. He's shown success against the blitz, and I assume Brian Flores is going to load up on that against him.
That is not an assumption. That is a fact.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, there's definitely a floor, but you're not really worried. Like you said, you're not really worried about the floor in GPP. It's more about the ceiling. And if that game shoots out, I like that call, especially if he's got Devontae Adams. Anyone that has that kind of a receiver to lean on has upside if you can get him in the end zone a couple of times. But before we move on to the running back position, we've got Toronto Dave, one of our favorites.
Dave.
Thanks for joining us, Dave, in the chat. And Older Budweiser, another one of our favorite regulars, has a question for us.
Back.
Yeah, it's good to see you. So 3 of 5.5 PPR, Rashee Rice, Javonte Williams, James Cook, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, we're going to talk about him, and Jalen Waddle. So we got a half PPR there, and we need 3. So I'm just rolling through these lists right now. What do you think on that? I've developed a list as I was reading that. And I think we're going to do the same.
I'll take the easy one and say Jalen Waddle.
Yep, that's one.
The next name that came out for me was Javonte Williams.
That's 2. This is where it gets a little dicey.
3 gets a little tricky. Yeah, that's exactly where I was going. I would probably err on the side of the steady workload for James Cook.
That's Cook. Me too.
I mean, CEH is obviously in a plus spot. Rashee Rice is in a similar plus spot. A little bit more of a difficult matchup for him, but a lot of unknowns in terms of how Kansas City is going to score the ball this week. At least the means by which, I should say. Whereas Cook, we know exactly what to project out of him week in and week out.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that too. And Rice is a rising play in that offense, but we haven't really been able to trust any wide receivers on that team this year. Even though he leads in targets per route run, he's still not running as many routes as some of the receiver counterparts. So he has that floor. So I would agree. I mean, it's Waddle, Williams, and Cook for me and a half PPR there. So thanks for the question. Keep them coming if you're listening to us now. We're going to move on to the running back position and see what we can come up with for that. So I'm going to kick this off with Christian McCaffrey. I wrote about this in the Football Diehards Cash article that I put out yesterday. And I'm going to keep it very simple here. Don't leave your cash games without Christian McCaffrey in them. He's got to be the first button that you click in there. He's got 12 touchdowns in 12 games. He already has 1,000 yards rushing, which would be enough anyway for an elite season. We haven't even talked about his receiving, that he's got over 450 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. He's once again at the top in both receptions and targets. And he's too cheap. He should be over 10,000, plain and simple, just the way he gets usage here. Last week he took on arguably the top ranked run defense in the league and just did what he did. And he should do it again. Seattle projects as tough in the between the tackles as well, but McCaffrey doesn't need to go between the tackles. He destroyed them for 34 DraftKings points 2 weeks ago. He shouldn't be 9,200. Click him into your lineups for cash. So I'm curious, though, how you treat that for GPP, because it looks like the rostership is following this take. Is he someone that you're underweight on or that, or do you just play, he's Christian McCaffrey, so I'm not going to worry about that other stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a bit of both. To your prior question, I will be underweight. He's someone that I'll probably have closer to like 15 to 18% of exposure to. The fun thing with Christian McCaffrey, especially in a week where Brock Purdy is drawing some rostership, is pairing a running back and a quarterback in a stack is always.
I did it last week in cash.
Exactly, yeah, and it's always an overlooked option, right? So like you sort of have this cheat code with Christian McCaffrey to where you can always hedge against his rostership by stacking him up with Purdy. So something to consider, right? By no means does mid-20s ownership or does a 9.2K price tag, scare me away in terms of the tournament context.
Yeah, I think that's the correct take as well too, with GPP playing him, and you got to take pricing into account as well when you do, and he's just too cheap. But a couple of other guys I'm curious to get your takes on in this top end, and that's Alvin Kamara and Austin Eckler. Kamara, I think he's not showing near as much rostership because if people are paying for a running back, it's McCaffrey they're paying for. But he's got arguably the nuts matchup against Carolina, who we've been attacking with running backs all year, and people have seemed to have forgotten about him in that sense. You're into Kamara, I assume, for GPP in this game?
I absolutely am. Yeah. And you laid out the point perfectly, right? Like he is huge leverage off of Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah, and he has the means, the talent, and the workload to outscore him too. I think in my rankings right now, I have them 1 and 2. But that could easily be flopped. McCaffrey is not a lock to be the running back 1 every week, and if Kamara outscores him, especially with some of these receivers questionable, Taysom Hill in general, Kamara would presumably get all the red zone workload if he was to sit. I like that play a lot. I'll be overweight on him in GPP for sure. Eckler is the one I'm really want to get your take on too. We've had some coach speak come out this week that Eckler is struggling and they might dial him back a little bit for Joshua Kelly, who has sucked this year. So I don't really know. It's tough what to make of that, but his price has come down a little bit. He was perpetually over 8,000. He's at 7,600 now. And Denver has given up the most fantasy points per game to running backs. So how are you treating Eckler this week?
Yeah, I mean, to your prior point, like Staley is just going out of his way to find the most back-asswards things to do
in terms
of game planning and catching. Like it's almost like he wants to see how far he can push it before he actually gets fired. There is not a world where they make the decision to limit Austin Eckler's usage for efficacy purposes, right? Like the alternative in Kelly is not even in the same stratosphere, right? So I think some of this is poorly executed gamesmanship, maybe. But nonetheless, that swirling around out there, Austin Eckler certainly hasn't been playing up to the level that, we grew accustomed to in recent years, but he's still a very capable running back. He's still going to see the vast majority of the workload in this backfield. He's largely going to be overlooked. So checking a huge box for me in terms of tournaments. And he gets this beautiful matchup, right? Denver is number 1 in terms of fantasy points allowed, in terms of rushing yards per game to opposing running backs. Usually when you see teams hemorrhaging that sort of productivity on the ground, they're a bit tighter in terms of protecting the passes coming out of the backfield. Not the case with Denver either. I think they're number 7 in terms of receiving yards allowed to running back. So, I mean, for me, like I'm this close to pushing all my chips into the middle with Austin Eckler. Actually, I like this entire game environment, and I think we could see the shades of old Austin Eckler at 2 to 5% rostership.
Yeah, I'm right there with you on that one for sure. And I really like the idea, game stacking aside of using the 2 guys we just mentioned in GPP as kind of a double leverage off McCaffrey and GPP. So I'm into it for sure. Moving down the list a little bit in this mid tier, I'm kind of high low on this thing, but what do you think of some of these guys in kind of the 5,500 to 7K range? I wrote about Mixon in a couple of articles. You mentioned the game plan that the Bengals did last week, and basically what it was in a nutshell was, Browning is not the vertical threat that Joe Burrow is, and we saw that kind of benefit Mixon, who had 7 targets and caught 6 of them. So 6,100 in a game that is against not a good rush defense anyway. I'm into him at that price, especially if he's involved in the passing game like I think he's going to be. And then Moss, I'll get your take on Zach Moss for GPPs, but he's going to be massive chalk again. His price didn't go up enough from 4,600, 5,900 that people are going to get off of that. Yes, I know, it was 2.7 yards per carry, and he basically was a chalk bust, but everybody had him, so it didn't really matter. and he played 94% of the snaps and he got 23 touches, and he's going to do that again. And it's a much better matchup this week against Cincinnati, who's given up over 4.5 yards per carry. So Moss is a cash lock for me. I am curious on your GPP take on him and other people you have in this tier.
Yeah, Moss is a big red flag for me in terms of GPP specifically, right? Like in cash, it's kind of an open and shut case, but for him to be already north of 30% rostership, largely because that price hasn't moved, he can really hurt your builds overall if he has a performance like he did last week. And granted, this matchup against Cincinnati isn't quite as stout as the one he had last week against Tennessee, but Cincinnati is no slouch against the run, right? Like they give up a fair amount of yardage. They give up kind of like a league average amount of scores, amount of touchdowns, right? So like this isn't a plus matchup, and we've seen Cincinnati pin their ears back at time and really slow down opposing running games. So kind of a hot and cold situation in terms of the matchup. But for me, the rostership, it just eating that kind of chalk in terms of your total build exposure, it just you're really looking for some 1-2% guys to pay off, and finding more than one of those people is hard to do in any given week.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to my camera there for a second there, but it didn't seem to have broken your flow. Yeah, it's especially with the passing. I think the passing game is such a good direct leverage off of Moss and GPP too. So I think that take you have there is great. Who else for you in this tier for GPP? Kind of this mid 6,000 range.
Yeah. I mean, Josh Jacobs is going to be a volume king every single week. I have some interest in stacking up that game, so he'll be in the player pool for me. Rachaad White, especially on DK, where you're getting the full point per reception. 6.8K is a little pricey for him, but I mean, he's been paying that off in spades, and he's probably not going to be that popular. So there's some interest there. The perennial, I guess, weekly question of what to do with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery presents itself yet again. DK basically made them the same price, so we can do sort of whatever we please. For me, I think both of them are in the player pool. I tend to lean towards Gibbs a little bit, just because of his role, at least his predominant role, as a pass catcher out of that backfield. Chicago is number 2 in the league in terms of yards per reception to running backs this year. So it could be, one of those upside games for Gibbs. So don't mind getting him in. We talked about Mixon, perfectly fine play. Javonte Williams, again, if I'm stacking up that Chargers Broncos game, he'll be in the player pool for me as well. You don't really need leverage off of Austin Eckler, but he's a pivot off of Austin Eckler and saves you a couple $1,000s at the same time.
Yeah, I'm into the Javonte play as well, too. And the Chargers are someone we've liked to attack on the ground for a couple of years now, and this year is no different. Moving into the lower tier. So I'll be the one that breaks the ice here because he's going to probably gain in rostership rapidly, and it's going to be a nice big tilt fest for everybody if he busts, which we've seen. But Clyde Edwards-Helaire is 4,200, expected to have... They already said he's the starter, whatever that means. But, I think he is definitely ticketed for extra work here. He's only gotten more than 7 touches in a game once this year. So I don't know. You want to be the glass half full guy and say he's fresh with some burst this year? Sure. I think ultimately in cash, you can treat him as the free square he is. He's almost minimum price because he's priced basically as a third string running back. He's 600 less than McKinnon, who hasn't played in a couple of games and who should also be looking at some expanded work here. But yeah, I'm fine with him in cash. I'll probably be playing him because, he'll let me fit McCaffrey and he'll let me fit Keenan Allen, who I really want. As well. So, in the last couple of hours, we've seen his rostership quadruple, which should continue. Is he a fade in GPP or is he still free?
I mean, he's not an outright fade, right? Because that implies sort of an opinionated stance. It's hard to beat free in just about every facet of life, including DFS, right? So like, he shouldn't strike his name from the player pool. I have concerns because I've seen this movie before, right? So don't want to get stung again. A secondary consideration. Pricing this week is actually a little bit softer, so there's not like this huge need for salary relief in order to fit in, X player. Like you can kind of do what you want in terms of how how your builds are coming together. So less of an emphasis on saving a few bucks, but most importantly, especially in the tournament context, Jerick McKinnon is going to be like 1/10 the rostership, and he's coming off of back-to-back full practices. I talked about the Bears being susceptible to receivers out of the backfield. Buffalo's right up there again, number 4 in the league, 8.2 yards per reception. That's obviously much more of McKinnon's role in this offense. A game that I think is going to set up for a lot of scoring in a very fast pace. That's a little bit more that sort of hurry up and pass protection workload is typically what we expect McKinnon to take on. So, yeah, I mean, there's no functional reason to strike CEH out of the player pool, but there are a lot of practical reasons that are going to have me looking elsewhere.
Yeah, I think you outlined that, perfectly. Really, it's and it's a good point about the pricing too. I was actually noticing that myself, that it's not difficult to fit in.
Yeah, you can do what you want.
The guys you want this week, that's not to say it's not difficult to pick the complimentary guys, but
yeah.
If you want
two things, two different things entirely.
Yes, true. But yeah, McCaffrey's rostership being that high is not just a product of who he is, but what you said as well too, that he's, people are finding him easy to fit in. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Anybody you're looking at in this range besides McKinnon as a pivot off him before we move to wide receiver?
A couple names to mention. Jerome Ford continues to be too cheap. The matchup this week isn't the best in the world, but by all means, 5.5K for a guy that's going to see this workload is just not computing for me. So he'll be in the pool for sure. I do think that this is the week where we see Keaton Mitchell take a bit of a step forward in terms of his role in this offense. He's kind of like a Devon Achane light in that every touch that he gets the ball in his hands is one that he can do something explosive with. So don't mind having him in the player pool. If you're throwing a dart, if you're looking for creative ways to get into this Detroit and Chicago game, don't mind Roschon Johnson here, largely because Chicago being number 2 in yards per reception and running backs, Detroit is number 1. And I think that he's going to have a lot of that pass catching workload available to him. So pretty good path to paying that off. If you really want to get weird in the Broncos game, Jaleel McLaughlin is also basically free and still has a decent enough role in this offense. So, not a ton of names in the pay down option, but some that you can definitely work with.
Yeah, I like the Ford call a lot there too. He's doesn't seem to want to be priced up at all.
It is, or do it.
Despite what he's what he's been doing for that team. I mean, now he's getting more. He's starting to flip the balance of the red zone work too. That was the big knock on him. The Kareem Hunt was taking all the touchdown equity, but he's getting it now too. So I'm into that play. So moving on to wide receiver. And again, just some housekeeping. If you're with us and you got any questions, throw them in the chat. We'd be happy to answer them or do the best we can. DFS season long related, does not matter. Wide receiver. Moving into that top tier. So some things to highlight here. First of all, we have the return of Justin Jefferson, and he's 8,500, which is about $1,000 less than we're used to seeing him. So I don't see him as a cash play, so I'll let you kind of talk about him. But I'll mention a couple of guys that I like in the cash perspective first. The first one being Keenan Allen. I think as I mentioned in the cash article that I wrote, if it weren't for Tyreek Hill, I think Keenan Allen would be making a strong push for Offensive Player of the Year. He leads the league in targets and receptions. He's third in receiving yards. He's second in fantasy points per game. And the big thing here, the knock on him as he was getting older was, his average depth of target was diminishing so much, but he's seventh in the league in air yards this year too. Where he lines up in the slot, he's probably likely to avoid that Surtain coverage that we like to try and dance around when we're facing off against Denver. He to me is not expensive enough right now at 8,600 for just the immense floor he's given you and the fact that he's got a ceiling here. So of all these top guys, if I'm picking one for cash, it's him. I do like, where did that thing go? I do like Jamar Chase too. I can't mention Jake Browning the way I was earlier without talking about Chase as well. He's, he is basically priced. He's kind of what, the Monday night special we got, or the Sunday nights. Did they play Sunday? Whatever. He was, he played before DraftKings or after DraftKings released the pricing for the next week. And, I was like, oh, it's Jake Browning's his quarterback, but he went nuts with Browning as his quarterback. He's only 7,600, which for him is about $1,000 too cheap too. So I think in cash, if you want to play him, he's perfectly fine. I wouldn't sacrifice Allen for him. But those are two high-end guys I like. What are you looking at in GPP in this high range? And, make sure you tell our listeners here your thoughts on Jefferson, because I'm kind of back and forth.
Yeah, so opening up the kimono a little bit, basically everyone in the high tier on our show sheet is someone that I've highlighted, except for Keenan Allen, and that's because of the stark contrast between cash and GPP. Like the floor is so tremendous that you almost have to click the button at this price for cash. But in GPP, specifically in that Surtain matchup, I would worry about the ceiling, right? So, just kind of a fun contrast to highlight. Running down this list of high tier options, Stephon Diggs, he's in the most desirable game as the primary pass catcher for the Bills. He will be in the player pool. You're never wrong having Amon-Ra St. Brown in the player pool as well. For me, those two are along with Keenan Allen and Justin Jefferson are almost a kind of separate tier onto themselves. Jefferson is probably my favorite wide receiver play on the board, honestly. Where we sit right now, sub 8% rostership, pretty reasonable little price tag, a little haircut on his price tag relative to where we see him. And he gets the absolute golden matchup against this Raiders secondary, right? Everything that you're looking for is there. I understand the concerns about it being his first game back, about him, not having actually played a game with Joshua Dobbs. I think all of that very quickly gets put to bed, and we're in line for a potential slate-breaking performance with Justin Jefferson, assuming that his rostership holds here, right? Like if he's sub 10% even, he's a guy that you would almost have to roster if he hits the ceiling and you're trying to take down a big tournament. So love Jefferson this week. Jamar Chase is in a fine spot. Mike Evans, despite the difficult matchup on paper, he absolutely torched AJ Terrell earlier in the season. That'll be his primary matchup again this week. So something of note there. I don't find myself getting into that game a lot, but as a one-off player, he's fine. I kind of mentioned this earlier.
Is Terrell playing? I saw he was kind of iffy with a concussion.
I haven't seen an update.
Because that would be an upgrade to him too. As of yesterday,
considerable. Yeah, at that point he would be looking at a CUDA, which is an even better spot, right?
Yeah. So that's something to be watching for as well too. But go ahead.
I'll pull up this injury report and let it spin while I keep talking through here.
Okay. Yeah. Bob says he's questionable. Thanks, Bob.
There you go. I was mentioning this with CJ Stroud. I kind of like Nico Collins here. Um, all of this goes by the wayside if there's wind in this game environment, specifically 20 miles an hour or faster. Generally just avoiding those passing games on the whole. But last week, Nico Collins saw the majority of his routes run in Patrick Surtain's coverage, and in that coverage, he caught 3 or 4 passes for 80 yards. Like, I would much rather see this replicated again and again, but that was kind of a statement performance for me. Obviously, without Tank Dell out there, there's going to be more heaped on Nico Collins this week. But I mean, we could be at a point where, we're thinking about Nico Collins as one of those players where, even a tough matchup might not necessarily slow him down. So, maybe more of a note, maybe I'll be the sicko that's clicking his name. But I mean, he showed me something in that matchup against Rattan, and I'm less concerned about him than I would be with other wide receivers facing this Jets perimeter. I mentioned it off the top with the interest in the Raiders game that puts Devontae Adams in my pool. Chris Olave. Hopefully, we see Jameis Winston. Even if not, he should be able to pay off $7K. And then Michael Pittman, like you mentioned, is fantastic leverage off of Zach Moss, and is also playing incredibly well. I think he's had 8 catches in like 4 or 5 straight games. He's just been so steady. Really getting into a good rhythm with Minshew. So don't mind him at 7.3K either.
Oh, he's to me, he's underpriced at 7.3. Yeah. I mean, his target count you're right, 8 catches in 5 straight weeks or more. His target count is 16, 13, 12, 8, and 13 the last 5 weeks. That is upper level wide receiver 1 usage. And he isn't priced that way. He's 7,300. With that kind of workload and with the production that he's only got 2 touchdowns over the last 5 games, which I guess, is keeping him down there. He also doesn't have a star quarterback, but the fact that he's $1,000 cheaper than Amon-Ra St. Brown, 1,500 cheaper than Stephon Diggs for the same workload, is silly to me. So I think he can be played in any contest. But you're right. He's right now looking at the best leverage to me off of Zach Moss chalk. Especially if you don't want to play the Colts back and receiver in the same game. I did last week and it worked out nicely. But I'm into him at 7,300 for sure. All right. So moving along, we got about 10 or so minutes left to go. We're moving into this mid tier here. For cash, at the bottom end, I wrote about this guy too. I'm into Zay Flowers this week. He's been the most direct beneficiary of Mark Andrews' injury at 8 targets last week. We were talking about positive TD regression, and that came last week. He scored twice. Granted, one was on a run, not a pass, but still. He's not priced appropriately for the increased role that he's getting. I'm also into Garrett Wilson. This is a little bit further below 5,500, which feels utterly gross to say with, the debacle that is the Jets offense right now. With, we didn't talk much this week about how they wanted Zach Wilson back and Zach Wilson didn't want to come back. And then 18 hours later, he's pumped to be the starter again. I don't know, but
somebody's not telling the truth.
No, I don't really know. It's insane. I don't think Sally's gonna survive that. I mean, whether it's his fault or not, I don't know. What a mess. But the fact remains that despite all of Zach Wilson's struggles, he still targeted Garrett Wilson. Has targeted him 56 more times than any other member on the Jets roster. These might be low percentage targets that he gets with Wilson's inefficiencies, but if he's getting double-digit targets at 5,500 with his talent, I'm in. So that's kind of where I am. What are you looking at in this tier?
Yeah, there's a lot to like in this tier for me, especially as we get towards the bottom of it. The highest that I'm going right now, DJ Moore at 6.5K. I like getting into this game again. But also as is much of the offense, but he's an entirely different player with Justin Fields out there, right? Like in games where Justin Fields is starting, DJ Moore's averaging almost 100 yards and just a hair under a touchdown per game. I like this game to potentially shoot out. Love getting to more. Cortland Sutton, like I said, I'm going to be the weirdo going with the Denver Chargers hammer, so he'll be in the pool for me. I like kind of leveraging off of moderate Jamar Chase rostership with T Higgins. 5.9K is an insane price tag for him. He's on the field a ton. You beat up on these perimeter corners for the Colts if you want to move the ball through the air. So, he should be in a fine spot. Kind of like Amari Cooper this week. I'll caveat that by saying in hopes that Joe Flacco starts again. Joe Flacco looked great for a guy coming off the couch. He looked like he was, capable of running an NFL offense. The Jaguars are a bit of a pass funnel. They really clamp down against the run, so you can move the ball through the air. Love the Zay Flowers call. Gabe Davis, you can click the button and hope that you see that AFC divisional round game redux in this one. Obviously, he'll avoid the Snead matchup, which is really what you're trying to do. So plus spot for him. And then I probably like Jacoby Myers as my favorite way to get into this Las Vegas side where I'm stacking up that game with Minnesota.
Yeah, that's a fun one too. And I'm with you for sure on that Raiders Vikings as being a very sneaky way to get into this thing. But we get a question here from Scott, one of our favorites here. Scott was in my SFB 13 league for the last 2 years in the Boston Live. It's one of our favorites. And the question, how worried are you guys about the really bad weather in Baltimore on Sunday in terms of DFS? Yeah, that's it's definitely one to watch out for. For right now, it doesn't look like the wind is going to be, unless I'm looking at the wrong thing. Yeah, the wind there is not forecasting to be too terrible as of this moment. It just looks like heavy rain. To me, that's not, like you said with the Jets game, I don't really get concerned about the weather until the winds pick up. Rain, whatever. I mean, yeah, I know the ball is slippery, but I don't really downgrade receiver. What about you? The passing, for me, it's wind. Wind is the key thing.
Wind is absolutely the key thing. But if you look over my shoulder, we have an upper level low. I'm just kidding. Wind is very much the thing to watch here. Where we sit right now, they're projecting about 14 mile an hour gusts, which is perfectly manageable, right?
Yeah.
For me, that mark of that line of demarcation is anything over 20 miles an hour sustained, anything over 25 miles an hour in terms of gusts. That's where it becomes a bit of a concern. But I mean, specifically with these teams, right? Like there's going to be such an emphasis on the ground game anyways, to where, the rain is even further mitigated.
Yeah. Can you do like the Bill Murray thing, Groundhog Day? You see Groundhog Day, where like and the clouds start to move. Almost just spit in the room over here. Thanks for that, Scott. Yeah, that's definitely something to keep an eye on. I'm gonna parlay that into the tight end talk here, because right now the way I'm leaning as far as a cash tight end goes here is Isaiah Likely at 3,500. It's very encouraging what we saw out of him in this passing game. He led the Ravens in receiving. Yes, I know it was only 40 yards. But still, he played 73% of the offensive snaps. He is in that pricing range where I want to be in cash. I'm of the mindset that you're either paying for Kelsey or, whoever the top end thing in a nut matchup, or you're just saving money at the tight end position and the cheapest guy with value you can get. And I think that's likely this week. The Rams are giving up the third most fantasy points per game to tight ends. So I think he's in a really good spot here for the Ravens. Other tight ends that I like in this lower range, I think you can go back to Brevin Jordan, who played almost every down for the Texans last week. Dalton Schultz has been ruled out again. And I'm curious your thoughts. I like Tanner Hudson. I feel like I like him more than the field right now, which is probably going to keep me away from him in cash. But, at $2,800, I know it's a tight end committee, but he does have a bit of an edge on it. And I think that's okay for GPPs in that offense there. But where are you on the tight end position this week?
Yeah, Hudson is a fine play if you're looking to punt, right? Sub 3K is not nothing in terms of savings. That committee circumstance is valid, but it seems like he's got a bit of a rapport going with Browning. The matchup is a plus spot for him as well. Weirdly enough, the last 3 weeks really, I found myself paying up at tight end, which is not a place that I typically go or candidly like to be. But here we are. Travis Kelce. I mean, look, he's not the Travis Kelce that we've known and loved in recent years, but still has the highest likelihood to lead the position at scoring on any given week. He's in the matchup game that you want to get into, and he's like sub 10% rostered. So very interested. I'm assuming we'll see that creep up as we get closer to Sunday, but as long as he's sub 20%. He's someone that I'll look to have some exposure to. Sam Laporta is probably my favorite pay up option at 6.1K. Again, I want to get into this game with Detroit and with Chicago. Chicago in particular is a very favorable matchup, number 4 in terms of fantasy points allowed per game to opposing tight ends. They're allowing tight ends to catch 81% of their passes, which is wild. So he's about to pay that off. And right there next to him at 6K flat, one of 2 guys that is facing a team that's allowing a higher catch rate, TJ Hawkinson. The Raiders are allowing an 82.1% catch rate to tight ends. We all know Josh Dobbs loves to pepper tight ends with targets. The only limiting factor for that is the majority of my Vikings exposure is probably going to go to Justin Jefferson, but I'll have a subset of my builds where I'm going to be double stacking the Viking side. So some pretty expensive Hawkinson and Jefferson stacks are in my future. Beyond that, the guys you touched on are really the ones of note. Dalton Kincaid, another way to get into this game. Kansas City's a little bit tougher against the tight end, but Kincaid has a very large role in an offense that should be firing on all cylinders. So don't mind getting there as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought him up. I was going to ask you about him after you were done with that, if you didn't mention him. Are you at all concerned if Dawson Knox does play? Would that, kind of put Kincaid in the too expensive category, or are we kind of the mindset that he's the tight end now on that team?
Yeah, so for me, I would almost kind of prefer if Dawson Knox plays, because I want to get Dalton Kincaid at like sub 1%. I think that would draw all of the rostership away from him. Whether or not Kincaid is kind of the guy, quote unquote, it is to be seen. But when Dawson Knox was available earlier in the season, the Bills just ran a ton of 12 personnel. And I would imagine that would be the game plan again if Knox is available, right? He's coming off of 3 straight full practices, so probably going to be out there if I had to speculate. But I think in terms of snaps on the field, Kincaid will still be out on the field a ton, but that'll obviously plummet his rostership, and that's exactly the opportunity that a twisted tournament player is looking for.
Yeah, and we're looking, I think right now, as it stands, we joked about Friday ownership really having honestly no clue. Yeah. But as it stands right now, it looks as though the field is assuming Knox in, because, you mentioned that sub 1K percent, and that's kind of where he looks to be right now. So we'll monitor that as it goes along. Before, I think we forgot to mention David Njoku on this one.
That's right.
I think we should just touch on him real quick, just because he right now is showing as the highest rostered tight end on the slate at 4,100. What's your take on him? I was more into him last week, and then I kind of got off of him as when Joe Flacco was named the quarterback. And it kind of, it was the right call. He got 6 targets, but he only had 2 catches in that game. he has been a pretty prominent target in that offense, regardless of which quarterback is in. But I do like him a little better without Flacco as the quarterback. What's your take on Njoku in this one?
Yeah, that is precisely why he went unnamed for me. 4.1K is fine, right? Probably a little bit expensive for my likings, but specifically with Flacco back, it's still fine for tight ends. But saw his targets dip down to 6. It's the lowest in about a 4-week period. But also specifically his matchup this week is kind of tough. Like on fantasy points, the Jaguars are about league average. But if you look at some of their more functional stats, they're 29th in catch percentage allowed to the tight end, the 4th lowest. So if his targets are going down and he's in a spot where you can project him to catch fewer of them than he typically would, there are too many things working against him for me to feel good about clicking the name.
Yeah, and I'll also throw in the fact that's a great stat, and I'll also throw in the fact that Harrison Bryant had 5 catches and a touchdown
out of nowhere.
Yeah,
in the most annoying fashion possible.
Yeah, so I mean, he got the production increase with Flacco under center. So I don't know. I think with that plus the stats you mentioned, and the volatile quarterback situation there, that kind of screams bad chalk to me. So I'm good with the cheaper guys that we talked about there. But I think we laid that out nicely, and that's going to do it for us on this show. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be back more than likely in our regular time next week, Friday or Saturday night in the 9-ish o'clock hour Eastern. So be sure to join us for that for week 15 football. Can't believe it's getting to the end already. We'll be doing those Monday mock drafts with Bob and Mike on Sirius XM before you know it. And arguing about best balls that are 6 months away, like the degenerates that we are. But all right, Eric, anything you want to plug before we sign off?
No, I also can't believe that we're heading into week 14. If you are watching this and you are not part of the live audience, if you have any questions, drop those into the comments. Myself, maybe even Bob Harris or Jamie will be keeping an eye out for that. So definitely let us know if you have any questions if you are watching this on the replay.
Yes, absolutely. And please follow us on Twitter. We're footballing all over the place on there. I'm at JAC3600. Eric's at Fantasy Nav NAV. Hello, Albert. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you aboard with us for the very end of this show. And if you missed part of this, it'll be up on our site soon. You can go back and watch, and you can, listen to your heart's content over the next couple of days as you get your lineups prepared for Sunday. All right, that's going to do it for us. Make sure you tune into Bob and Mike for the football Diehards shows on Sirius XM Fantasy and Sirius XM NFL Radio. Eric and I will be back with you next week. And until then, good luck. We hope we get some winners in the chat. Take it easy.
Good luck, everyone.